Greetings, students. I'd like to welcome you to the history of privilege and oppression. I'll be your instructor for this course, and today we want to take a look at this whole notion of privilege and oppression. So walk with me as we go through the slides, and we will talk more explicitly about how some of the situations that we find ourselves in today come to be as they are. So there's some important things that we need to understand here about the time that we have together. When we're talking about systems of privilege and oppression, these are often fairly complex and tough subjects. So I just want to have everyone to have a heads up about that particular notion. But I also think that it's very important, as the slide is indicating, that there are, and what we'll be doing in this course of this class is we'll be exploring a number of different, or variety of different systems of privilege and oppression that are just a part of everyday life. We have been socialized in our country to just not see them. They're just invisible things that happen, but as to be effective social workers, to work in systems of change, to work across working with families who are in need, or whether there might be communities that may be having issues, or there are policy issues, it's to our advantage as social workers entering the field to really have an understanding about how these systems came to be, the influence that they continue to have on our society now, because we will run into them in the course of our work. It's just a naturally occurring phenomenon. And so this course is really designed to help you take a look at these different aspects of how these systems of privilege and oppression come together and how they complicate our work in terms of being a more social justice focused society. So given what we have talked about just now in terms of this is always information that's not always easily to experience or to hear, but we would ask you to do a couple of different things. So for the sake of this class, as well as for the sake of this presentation, I need you to be fully present, to listen and to respond, with an open mind, to prepare for some discomfort, because there are some things that you're going to hear or see that may be juxtaposed to what your belief and what you've been taught. I also want us to think about, and this gets to be very difficult at times, refraining others' viewpoints, or refrain from judging other people's viewpoints. It's easy for us to have people that we connect with, that we get along with, because we can resonate. But when we have people who we don't see eye to eye with, that tends to be a source of discomfort and conflict oftentimes. We're going to look at utilizing the concept of appreciative inquiry, especially when we spend our time together. And that's the notion of really trying to understand how people see the way that they do and why. Not to judge it, but just to understand it. And also to be respectful, challenge your own mindsets, challenge what we've been taught and what we've believed, and then to reflect, just to really think about what if some of these things are actually true. So when we're together, I will definitely make sure that we create a safe space for all the participants so that you can bring your full selves to the conversation and share your truth. And then we'll talk about whether there are additional needs that you have from being a group member's perspective. Okay? So we always want to do our best, keep a positive attitude, and be respectful of each other. It's what social workers do. So I thought an interesting way to maybe start this particular conversation is that I know that a lot of people in our country, across the world, tend to be visual learners. So I thought if we would start to look at this whole notion of privilege and oppression and do it in a visual way, that it might be more beneficial, because if we can sometimes see what transpires, and it might be a little easier for us to grasp and understand some of the concepts. So this is a tool that I discovered a couple of years ago, which does a nice job. And I also want to just indicate that this particular tool in and of itself does not capture every nuance or every form of privilege and oppression that there is. And so there would just be no time in the space of a course to actually talk about all of those particular dynamics. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus, for the most part, in this class and the time that we have, on some of the primary issues that we see affecting our society as well as our work on a day-to-day basis. So if you take a look at the screen, you will see this particular picture, and what it's depicting is how privilege and oppression actually works. So when we start to look above the line, we can start to see that privilege is here. And so when we start to think about male, white, European, heterosexual, able-bodied, credentialed and highly literate, young, attractive, upper middle class, Anglophobes, folks who speak English as a first language, colorism, religious oppression, and pronatalism. So if you have these attributes, and you may have been born into situations where these are things that were just there for you, that you often had no control over or no ability to move yourself from one category to another, but they were just simply there. If we look below the line, we also start to see what the oppression actually looks like. So for those who don't carry the characteristics of those who live in our society, we start to look above the line, then you have this oppression and you have this resistance. So when we have darker skinned people compared to lighter skinned folks, when English is your second language, when you're poor or when you're working class, if you're deemed by society standards to be unattractive or old, if you're not literate, if you're not credentialed, if you have a disability, if you're gay, lesbian, transsexual, transgender, if you're non-European, if you're a person of color, if you're a female, or if you are of what's called a deviant gender. So when we start to think about transgender, the other side of that genderism piece is male and female and masculine and feminine, and anything other than those particular concepts in that form or fashion is considered deviant. And then we also look at things like non-fertile versus fertile. So there's a difference in terms of the level of oppression that folks who are able to actually produce children as opposed to those who are not. So this is just a visual representation of what privilege and oppression looks like, and you have to have one to have the other. And so we'll spend some more time really looking at this particular diagram over the course of this course as we kind of dig down into understanding some of this that we're faced with. So it's always important to define and to really talk about what we've got in front of us. And so some simple definitions, I think, that will get us started and for us to kind of think about. And so when we think about privilege, we think about a special right or an advantage or an immunity that's granted to a particular group or group of people. So, you know, it can be very complicated because I think a lot of times the idea of what privilege actually is means something very different. So I'll give you an example. So having gone to college, I graduated, I had a degree. That degree then gave me certain privileges to access certain types of employment. So without that particular degree, I would not have access to that particular privilege. So that's an example of an earned privilege over time. But there are also privileges that I possess that are not necessarily earned, that I was just born into a system where I had that particular attribute and there was nothing that I had to do to earn that. So, for example, I am a male. And so being a male in our country carries certain privileges that being a female in this country does not. I didn't do anything to secure or to demonstrate or to set that dynamic in place. It simply existed and I was born into it. So when we think about privilege, we have to think about it from those particular two lenses, whether there are things that you can earn to move socially in this particular society or economically, as well as there are naturally occurring things that happen that we often don't have any control over. When we look at the opposite end of privilege, we have oppression. And so we look at oppression as restricting access to resources and the marginalization, isolation based on a social group. So when we think about who has access and what are the criteria to be able to access certain goods and services in our country, whether they're administered by our government, whether they are coming from nonprofit agencies, whether they're just a pure function of capitalism, we also have to keep in mind that there are systems that are in place that will restrict the access of some people in some particular circumstances and situations as it relates to being able to have access. So again, it's about withholding resources based on social group membership. I'm trying to think of an example that I could utilize in terms of that. All right, so here's one that comes out in terms of a source of or way that people are discriminated against. So if I fill out a job resume and I put a name that may sound foreign or may sound African or may sound Hmong or may be sounding African American, if I'm an employer and I see that particular name and I'm looking for a candidate, then I might look at the name of that particular person, regardless of what their experience may look like, but I will make an assumption sometimes based on that person's name or the spelling or what it means or what I think that it means. And I might decide to not move that person on for an interview just based on that's not the kind of person that I'm looking for, because the name in and of itself says that this person may be of a different ethnicity, and we're really looking to have someone else in this particular position. That's a form of oppression. So it happens on an individual basis, or it could happen at an institutional level, and only the person who makes that decision or is allowed to make that decision about who moves on in the hiring process gets to make that decision. So that could be a form of oppression. And then we have these systems of oppression. So when we start to think about who's in a system and what systems are made of, they're comprised of people. And they create these structures that actually limit the power, the access to power, and to legal systems, into financial systems, into educational systems. So if we think about, for an example, if I want to buy a house, then the reality is that there are certain things that must be in place according to the structure or the system, as it relates to money, as it relates to income, as it relates to credit score, as it relates to a lot of different things that will be determinant whether I'm actually qualified for a mortgage or whether I'm not. And so if I don't meet certain criteria, or if I'm a part of a system that has just decided that because my name is what it is, that I can't get this job to make this type of income, then the likelihood of me being able to live in the neighborhood or buy the house that I want becomes marginalized, and that's a part of a system. So when we think about these things, keep in mind these particular definitions. We also need to then historically look back at this whole notion of colonialism. And so oftentimes, many of us who grew up in this country and took American history learned about the 13 colonies and the importance of the 13 colonies in our own history. But what the reality is that we have to recognize is that colonialism is the actual full or partial political control over another country. We invade, we have whatever argument that we're having, and we need to resolve it through the use of military force. And once we have subdued your country, then we get to occupy and own it, as well as we get to exploit it economically. So you'll find out a little bit here later in the presentation about just the number of countries that have been colonized around the world, or a part of the number of countries that have been colonized around the world, so we can start to see where this whole system of privilege and oppression starts to originate. We also then have to be aware of this system of patriarchy. And so when we think about patriarchy, we're looking at systems of society as well as government where males are designated as the head of families, the head of businesses, the head of governmental systems. And if you look at our current political structure and look across the actual aims of political power in this country, you will find that by and large, they are men, and they tend to be white men, and women are largely excluded. It's encouraging as we look at this particular session of Congress where the numbers are starting to shift ever so slowly, but we're starting to see a change in that. And so again, it's historical in terms of its nature. And then the society where communities is organized around patriarchal lines. And we'll talk more about that later in the course as well too. So just to make sure that we understand these particular dynamics. And then finally, the final straw in terms of this matrix of domination is the notion of capitalism. So when we think about capitalism, we're looking at an economic and a political system of countries, trade, and industry. And they're governed by private owners as opposed to being controlled by the state. That's a very important distinction that we need to recognize when we're looking at digging into these particular issues. When we also start to look at GM and Walmart and Sony and Apple, and these are just entities that I chose for no particular reason other than they are larger corporations that are privately owned by stockholders, and they drive and they influence a lot of decisions that are made politically and economically, as well as educationally as well too. So when we start to think about all of these particular things, we recognize that these are factors that we have to take into consideration. So when we start to look at the matrix of domination, we start to see that it's all built on the notion that there has to be some form of oppression that actually makes this work. And so when we start to look historically at the origins of our country, we recognize colonialism for what it is. We also recognize the fact that capitalism was one of the main ventures for coming to the New World, as well as patriarchy. And so when we combine all of these particular sets of circumstances, then we come up with this matrix of domination. These are some examples of countries that have been colonized by Great Britain. You can actually see one very familiar flag down there at your right, and that is the United States flag. So we ourselves at one point in time were colonized, but if you recognize in some of these flags and have been to some of these countries, you recognize that these were once the properties or were colonized by Great Britain. When we start to think about this notion of independence, and so once again, when we think about the political and financial exploitation of countries due to being occupied via the forces of colonization, then we also recognize that these are places that received their independence. So you can see that there are some places that were actually let me just stop here.